The music was too loud, the lights too dim, and the whiskey too cheap. But none of that mattered when she walked over to his table that humid Bangkok night. David Richardson had no idea he was about to make the most expensive mistake of his 54-year-old life. A mistake that would cost him his savings, his sanity, and nearly his soul. This is the story of a man who thought he was a savior, but became prey instead. If you're curious about stories that reveal the dark side of human nature and the dangerous games people play with each other's hearts, make sure to subscribe to our channel. Because what happened to David could happen to anyone who confuses loneliness with love. David Richardson had been living in emotional purgatory for 3 years. His wife Margaret had died of cancer when he was 51. Leaving him rattling around their 4-bedroom house in suburban Toronto, like a ghost haunting his own life. The insurance money sat untouched in his bank account, a reminder of the life that used to be. His grown children lived their own busy lives across the country, calling dutifully every Sunday, but never quite knowing what to say to their grieving father. He was an accountant by trade, methodical and careful with numbers, but completely lost when it came to navigating his new reality. The dating apps made him feel ancient and foolish. The widow support groups left him more depressed than when he arrived. His friends meant well, but their marriages felt like reminders of everything he'd lost. Sleep came in fragments. Food tasted like cardboard. Even his beloved hobby of restoring vintage motorcycles in the garage had lost its appeal. Then came the brochure in his mailbox. Thailand, land of smiles, golden temples, pristine beaches, and the promise of something different. His neighbor Jim had just returned from Bangkok, full of stories about the warmth of the people, the incredible food, and how far a Western pension could stretch in Southeast Asia. David found himself researching flights that same evening, his finger hovering over the purchase button for what felt like hours before finally clicking confirm. The trip was supposed to be 2 weeks of cultural exploration and personal reset. He'd booked a modest hotel in the backpacker district, planning to visit temples, take cooking classes, maybe even learn some basic Thai. But Bangkok had other plans for David Richardson. The city hit him like a wall of humidity, noise, and sensory overload. The traffic was chaos, the heat oppressive, and the language barrier more challenging than he'd anticipated. By his 4th night, he was questioning his decision to come at all. That's when his loneliness led him to Soi Cowboy, one of Bangkok's infamous red light districts. He told himself he was just curious, just observing the culture, just having one drink before heading back to his hotel. The neon signs promised escape, and David was desperate for anything that might dull the ache that had been his constant companion for 3 years. Her name was Ploy, though he'd later learn that wasn't her real name. Nothing about her would turn out to be real. She was 28 years old, or so she claimed, with long black hair that caught the bar's colored lights and eyes that seemed to hold the weight of the world. When she approached his table in the dimly lit go-go bar, David felt something he hadn't experienced since Margaret's death. The electric thrill of being chosen. Ploy spoke English with a melodic accent, her voice soft but confident. She didn't immediately ask for a drink or make the obvious transactional propositions he'd expected. Instead, she asked about his wedding ring, which he still wore on a chain around his neck. When he explained about Margaret, her eyes filled with what seemed like genuine sympathy. She told him about her own losses, her family's struggles in rural Aizan province, her dreams of a better life. Unlike the other women in the bar who seemed to be performing versions of sexuality and availability, Ploy appeared different. She listened when he talked about his life back in Canada, asked thoughtful questions about his work and his children. She shared stories of her childhood in a rice farming village, her parents' debt, her younger brother's medical expenses. The way she talked about family resonated with David's own values. Here was someone who understood loyalty, responsibility, and sacrifice. As the night stretched on, David found himself buying her drinks, but more importantly, buying into the fantasy that this beautiful young woman was genuinely interested in him as a person. When she suggested they leave the bar and go for late-night noodles at a street cart, David felt like he was 25 again. The city that had seemed hostile and overwhelming suddenly felt alive with possibility. What happened next would reshape David's understanding of himself and the world around him. But first, let's talk about the warning signs he ignored and the psychological vulnerability that made him the perfect target for what was about to unfold. The romance moved faster than a Thai motorcycle weaving through traffic. Within 48 hours of meeting Ploy, David had convinced himself he was experiencing something extraordinary. She had agreed to spend his remaining vacation days with him, playing tour guide and companion. Suddenly, Bangkok transformed from an intimidating maze into an adventure playground. Ploy showed him hidden temples, took him to family-run restaurants tourists never found, and introduced him to a Thailand that existed beyond guidebooks. But even in those honeymoon-like early days, there were moments that should have given him pause. The first red flag came when they visited a jewelry store. Ploy had mentioned wanting to buy something small for her mother, but once inside, she gravitated toward the expensive pieces. When David offered to help, thinking he was being generous with a small purchase, she didn't demur or protest. Instead, she accepted with a casualness that suggested this was expected rather than surprising. The second warning sign came during a video call with her family. Ploy had wanted David to meet her parents virtually, which he found touching and appropriate. But something felt rehearsed about the conversation. Her mother's English was suspiciously good for someone who supposedly lived in a remote village. Her father seemed to be reading from notes when he talked about their farm struggles. And there was something about the background that looked more like a middle-class home than the impoverished rice farm Ploy had described. The third red flag was the story of her ex-boyfriend, a German businessman who had supposedly broken her heart and left her with trust issues. The way she told the story felt designed to make David feel special by comparison. She would say things like, "You're so different from him," and "I never thought I could trust a foreign man again." It was exactly what a lonely, vulnerable man would want to hear from a beautiful young woman. But David was too intoxicated by the attention, the adventure, and the feeling of being needed to pay attention to these inconsistencies. For the first time in 3 years, he woke up excited about the day ahead. He felt useful, desired, and alive. When Ploy suggested he extend his trip for another 2 weeks, David didn't hesitate to change his flight. The sex was unlike anything he'd experienced in his marriage, not because it was more passionate or technically proficient, but because it felt transgressive and dangerous in a way that his middle-class Canadian life never had. Ploy seemed to worship his body in a way that made him feel powerful and masculine again. She would trace the gray in his chest hair with her fingertips and tell him how handsome older men were, how much she preferred them to boys her own age. More importantly, she seemed to need him in ways that Margaret never had. His late wife had been independent and capable, loving, but never desperate. Ploy painted herself as vulnerable and trapped, dependent on his strength and wisdom to navigate her difficult circumstances. She would curl up against him at night and whisper fears about her future, her family's debts, her inability to escape the bar life without help. The transformation in David was remarkable. The depressed widower who had arrived in Bangkok 2 weeks earlier was gone, replaced by a man with purpose and passion. He started making plans not just for the rest of his extended vacation, but for regular visits to Thailand. Maybe he could even relocate partially, keeping his Canadian residence but spending several months a year in Bangkok. The cost of living was so much lower that his pension would stretch much further. When Ploy started having emergencies that required money, David's accountant brain briefly engaged. A motorcycle accident involving her brother, sudden medical bills for her grandmother, the bar threatening to fire her if she didn't pay some unexplained debt. Each crisis came with tears, apologies, and promises to pay him back. Each time, David found himself transferring money or withdrawing cash from ATMs, telling himself he was helping someone he cared about during temporary difficulties. The amounts started small, a few $100s here and there. But as David's stay extended and his emotional investment deepened, the requests grew larger and more frequent. By the end of his second extended vacation month, he had spent more money in Thailand than he typically spent in 6 months at home. But it felt worth it. He was in love, and love required sacrifice. The fourth month was when David's new relationship began to consume his old life completely. He had returned to Toronto briefly to handle some business and check on his house, but spent every waking moment video chatting with Ploy. The time difference meant his sleep schedule was completely disrupted. He would wake at 3 in the morning to catch her before she went to work at the bar, then stay up until dawn, messaging her throughout her shift. His children began expressing concern about his dramatic personality change and his extended absences. His daughter Sarah flew in from Vancouver for what she called an intervention, worried that her father was having some kind of breakdown. She sat across from him in their family kitchen, looking at this man who bore little resemblance to the methodical, careful person who had raised her. David tried to explain about Ploy, about finding love again, about the possibility of starting a new chapter of his life. But the more he talked, the more worried Sarah became. This didn't sound like healthy romance to her. It sounded like obsession. She pointed out that he barely knew this woman, that he was making major financial decisions based on someone he'd met in a bar, that the cultural and age differences presented obvious complications he seemed to be ignoring. But David was beyond reason. In his mind, his family simply couldn't understand what he'd found in Thailand. They were stuck in their Western mindset, unable to appreciate the genuine warmth and authenticity of Thai culture. They thought all Thai women were scammers and all Western men who dated them were fools. He accused Sarah of being jealous of his happiness, of wanting him to remain lonely and miserable as some kind of monument to her mother's memory. The confrontation ended badly, with Sarah in tears and David more convinced than ever that no one understood what he and Ploy shared. Within 2 days, he was on another flight to Bangkok, this time with plans to stay for 3 months. He had liquidated some investments to fund this extended stay, telling himself it was temporary and that he could always rebuild his portfolio later. Ploy met him at the airport with tears of joy and passionate kisses that made every concern from his family evaporate. She had missed him desperately, she said. She had turned down other customers at the bar because she couldn't bear to be touched by anyone else. She had been counting the days until his return, living only for their video calls. David felt like the most important man in the world. But this third visit was different from the first two. Subtle changes in Ploy's behavior began to chip away at David's confidence, though he didn't recognize them as manipulation tactics at the time. She seemed less available, often busy with mysterious errands or family obligations. When they were together, she seemed distracted, frequently checking her phone and responding to messages in Thai that she would dismiss as unimportant when he asked about them. The physical intimacy that had been so intoxicating began to feel more transactional. Ploy seemed to be going through the motions rather than lost in passion. She would make comments about being tired from work, or having headaches, or needing to be careful about her energy. Sex became something that happened after David had proven his devotion through gifts or money transfers. Rather than the natural expression of mutual desire it had felt like initially. More troubling were the financial emergencies that now seemed to arrive weekly. Ploy's family was apparently facing an endless series of crises that required increasingly large sums of money. Her father needed surgery. The rice farm was failing due to drought. Her younger sister needed money for university tuition. Each story came with documentation that looked official, but felt somehow staged when David looked back later with clearer eyes. The requests were becoming more sophisticated too. Instead of asking directly for money, Ploy would mention the problems in passing, then become emotional when David offered to help. She would protest that she couldn't accept such generosity, that it wasn't fair to burden him with her family's problems. This reverse psychology made David feel like he was insisting on helping rather than being manipulated into it. By the end of his third month, David had spent the equivalent of 2 years of his pension on what he told himself was building a future with the woman he loved. He had moved from his modest backpacker hotel to a much more expensive service apartment that Ploy had suggested, ostensibly so they could have more privacy and space together. He was paying her bar fine every night so she didn't have to work, essentially becoming her sole source of income. The dependency went both ways, though. David had become completely reliant on Ploy for everything in Bangkok. She handled all interactions with taxi drivers, restaurant staff, and service providers. She managed his money, often holding his wallet and making purchases on his behalf. She had slowly isolated him from other expatriates he might have befriended, suggesting they were all losers or sex tourists who would give him bad advice about Thailand and Thai women. Most insidiously, she had begun to make David question his own perceptions and memories. When he would bring up inconsistencies in her stories or express concern about the mounting expenses, she would become hurt and defensive. She would accuse him of not trusting her, of thinking she was like other bar girls, of believing racist stereotypes about Thai women. She would cry and threaten to end their relationship if he really thought so little of her. David found himself apologizing for his suspicions and working to prove his love and trust. The psychological term for this is gaslighting, but David had never heard of it. All he knew was that the woman he loved seemed fragile and wounded by his doubts, and he wanted desperately to repair the damage his Western cynicism was causing to their relationship. The beginning of the end came during David's fourth visit to Thailand, 6 months after they'd first met. By now, he had spent nearly $40,000 on their relationship and had made the decision to sell his house in Toronto and relocate to Bangkok permanently. His children had essentially stopped speaking to him, treating him like he was having an extended mental breakdown. His few remaining friends back home had grown tired of his constant talk about Thailand and his dismissive attitude toward their concerns. David was waiting in their apartment for Ploy to return from what she said was a visa appointment at the Canadian Embassy. She had been discussing the possibility of visiting him in Canada, which felt like a major step forward in their relationship. He was researching engagement rings online, thinking it might be time to make their commitment official and start the process of bringing her to Canada as his fiancée. When Ploy's phone buzzed on the kitchen counter where she'd forgotten it, David initially ignored it, but the messages kept coming, and he could see they were in English. Curiosity and a growing sense of unease finally compelled him to look at the screen. What he saw would shatter his world more completely than Margaret's death had 3 years earlier. The messages were from someone named Mike, apparently another Western man. The conversation that David could see through the lock screen previews was intimate and familiar. Mike was asking when Ploy would be free tonight, mentioning that he'd transferred money to her account that morning, and making references to their plans for the weekend. The casual tone suggested this was not a new arrangement. David's hands shook as he tried to process what he was seeing. There had to be an explanation. Maybe this Mike was a relative or a family friend. Maybe the messages were being mistranslated by the phone's software. Maybe someone else was using Ploy's number. His mind scrambled for any alternative to the obvious conclusion that was forming like a sick feeling in his stomach. When Ploy returned an hour later, David confronted her with what he'd seen. Her reaction was not denial or shame, but anger. She accused him of violating her privacy, of not trusting her, of being a jealous old man who was trying to control her life. She snatched the phone away from him and said the messages were from a friend who was helping her practice English. When David pressed for more details, she became increasingly hostile and defensive. Have you ever experienced that moment when everything you believed about someone suddenly shifts into a completely different picture? When you realize that the person you thought you knew might be a complete stranger? Share your stories in the comments below, because what David discovered next would force him to question everything about the past 6 months of his life. The next few days were a nightmare of investigation and revelation. Unable to sleep or focus on anything else, David began to piece together the reality of his situation with the methodical precision that had made him successful in his accounting career. He started by doing something he should have done months earlier. He hired a private investigator in Bangkok who specialized in investigating Thai women involved with foreign men. The investigator's report, delivered just 3 days later, was devastating in its thoroughness. Ploy, whose real name was Nitaya, was 35 years old, not 28. She was married to a Thai man and had 2 children, living with her mother in Bangkok, not in the rural province she'd claimed. She had never worked in rice fields. Her family owned a successful restaurant in the city's Chinatown district. More crushing than the lies about her background were the details about her current life. The investigator had documented at least 4 other Western men who were simultaneously in relationships with Ploy, each believing they were her exclusive romantic partner. There was Mike from Australia, Klaus from Germany, Robert from England, and Jean-Pierre from France. Each man was supporting her financially while believing he was her primary relationship. The investigator had photos of Ploy with each of these men, looking exactly as loving and devoted as she had with David, the same intimate gestures, the same adoring expressions, the same apparent passion. It was like looking at a professional actress playing the same role in different productions. The restaurant where she had taken David for their special romantic dinners was the same place she took all of them. The apartment where they had made love was used for all her Western boyfriends, scheduled carefully to avoid conflicts. Even more sophisticated was the network supporting Ploy's operation. The investigator revealed that her family emergencies were coordinated with several other women working similar schemes. They shared props, documentation, and even family members who would play different roles in different scenarios. The old woman who had played Ploy's sick grandmother during video calls was actually a professional actress who specialized in scamming foreign men. The jewelry store where David had bought Ploy gifts had a relationship with her where she would return the items for cash after he left Thailand, splitting the proceeds with the store owner. The apartment he thought they were renting together was owned by someone in her network, allowing her to create the illusion of domestic partnership while actually running what was essentially a business operation. David felt physically sick as he absorbed this information. Every memory from the past 6 months was contaminated by this new knowledge. Every tender moment, every passionate encounter, every declaration of love had been a calculated performance. He thought about the nights he had held her while she cried about her difficult life, feeling protective and needed. He remembered the pride he'd felt when she told him he was different from other foreign men, that she trusted him in ways she'd never trusted anyone. The investigator's report also revealed the scope of David's financial losses. Between direct transfers to Ploy, payments for her supposed family emergencies, rent for their apartment, her shopping expenses, restaurant bills, and travel costs, David had spent nearly $60,000. His retirement savings had been cut in half. The house in Toronto that he had been preparing to sell was now going to be necessary to restore his financial security. But the money, devastating as its loss was, hurt less than the betrayal of trust. David had opened his heart completely for the first time since Margaret's death. He had shared his deepest fears, his dreams for the future, his vulnerability about aging and loneliness. He had believed he was building something real with someone who understood and loved him. Instead, he had been a mark in an elaborate con game. The worst part was realizing how predictable he had been. Reading the investigator's report, David could see that he had followed the exact pattern of behavior that women like Ploy counted on from men like him. Older Western men, recently widowed or divorced, financially comfortable but emotionally vulnerable, seeking validation and purpose in exotic locations where their money went further and their age was less of a disadvantage. He had ignored obvious red flags because they conflicted with the story he wanted to believe. He had dismissed his family's concerns because they threatened the fantasy he was living. He had allowed himself to be isolated from other perspectives and become completely dependent on Ploy for his sense of reality in Thailand. Every step of his psychological seduction had been orchestrated by someone who understood exactly how lonely men rationalize away their doubts. When David finally confronted Ploy with the investigators' findings, her mask dropped completely. The vulnerable young woman who had cried in his arms disappeared, replaced by someone cold and calculating who seemed almost bored by his emotional distress. She didn't even bother denying most of the facts, instead treating them as irrelevant details that shouldn't affect their relationship. "You think you're the only one with needs?" she asked him with a shrug that destroyed whatever remained of his illusions. "I have responsibilities. I have bills to pay. I have a life to live. You got what you wanted from me, didn't you? You felt young again. You felt important. You felt like a man. That was worth something to you, wasn't it?" Her casualness about the deception was somehow more devastating than anger would have been. David realized that to Ploy, he had never been a person with feelings and dignity who deserved honesty and respect. He had been a resource to be exploited, no different from a bank account or an investment portfolio. The fact that he was a human being who could be hurt by her actions was completely irrelevant to her calculations. The confrontation escalated quickly into territory that David had never experienced before. When he demanded the return of gifts and money, Ploy became aggressive and threatening. She reminded him that he was alone in a foreign country where he didn't speak the language, where she had all the connections and local knowledge. She suggested that Western men who caused problems for Thai women sometimes found themselves in dangerous situations with police who might not be sympathetic to their complaints. The implicit threat was clear. David could accept his losses and leave quietly, or he could find himself facing legal troubles in a justice system where he had no advantages and no allies. She mentioned that she had photos and videos of their intimate moments together, as well as records of all his financial transfers that could be presented as evidence of his intentions if necessary. The woman, who had once seemed so vulnerable and dependent, now revealed herself as someone much more dangerous and connected than David had ever imagined. David found himself trapped in a nightmare where every day brought new revelations about the depth of his deception and the extent of his vulnerability. He was thousands of miles from home, financially devastated, emotionally shattered, and now potentially facing legal or physical threats if he tried to recover any of his losses. The man who had thought he was rescuing a vulnerable young woman had become the victim in need of rescue. The realization of how completely he had been manipulated was perhaps the most devastating part of the entire experience. David had always prided himself on being intelligent and careful, someone who analyzed situations thoroughly before making decisions. But he had been played like a violin by someone who understood exactly which emotional buttons to push to make him behave predictably. Every aspect of Ploy's initial approach had been designed to appeal specifically to his psychological vulnerabilities. The apparent shyness and reluctance to take his money had been calculated to make him feel like he was offering help rather than being exploited. The stories about her family had been crafted to appeal to his values about loyalty and responsibility. Even the sexual dynamics had been carefully orchestrated to make him feel powerful and needed while actually rendering him powerless and dependent. David's escape from Thailand was not the dramatic confrontation or heroic resistance that movies might suggest. Instead, it was a careful, methodical process of minimizing further damage while extricating himself from an increasingly dangerous situation. The accountant in him took over, treating his departure like a complex financial restructuring where the goal was to limit losses rather than recover what had already been taken. First, he had to secure his remaining assets. David opened a new bank account and transferred his remaining funds, then cancelled all the credit cards that Ploy had access to. He discovered she had been using his financial information to make purchases he wasn't aware of, adding another few $1,000s to his losses. The process of securing his finances felt like performing surgery on himself, cutting away infected tissue while trying not to damage anything vital. Next, he had to disentangle himself from the apartment lease and other commitments he had made while believing he was building a life in Bangkok. This proved complicated because Ploy had inserted herself into many of these arrangements, supposedly to help him navigate the language barrier, but actually to maintain control over his living situation. Several deposits and advance payments had to be written off as unrecoverable losses. The most difficult part was accepting that there would be no justice, no recovery of his money, and no consequences for the people who had deceived him so thoroughly. The Thai police were not interested in what they saw as a personal relationship dispute between consenting adults. The fact that David had voluntarily given money to Ploy made it difficult to prove fraud, especially when she could present evidence of their intimate relationship as justification for his financial support. His own embassy was sympathetic but essentially powerless to help. They saw cases like David's regularly and had standard advice about being more careful with financial transactions in foreign countries. But they couldn't force the Thai justice system to pursue cases that weren't considered criminal under local law. David was advised to consider his losses an expensive lesson and focus on protecting himself from further harm. The flight back to Toronto felt like a journey from one life to another. David stared out the airplane window at the lights of Bangkok disappearing below him and tried to process what had happened to him over the past 8 months. The man who had first arrived in Thailand had been depressed and lonely but financially secure and emotionally stable. The man returning to Canada was devastated in every possible way, but also oddly liberated by the complete destruction of his illusions. The house in Toronto felt like a museum of his former life when he walked through the door. Everything was exactly as he had left it months earlier, but David felt like he was visiting the home of a stranger. The man who had lived here before his Thai adventure seemed naive and innocent. Someone who had never experienced real betrayal or understood how completely wrong he could be about another person. His children were waiting for him, having been alerted to his situation by his obvious distress during their last phone conversation. Sarah had flown in from Vancouver again, this time not for an intervention, but for damage control. The sight of their father, aged years in the span of months and clearly traumatized by his experience, dissolved any urge they might have had to say, "I told you so." Instead, they focused on helping him begin the process of rebuilding his life. David's recovery was not the quick bounce back that his practical nature wanted it to be. The financial losses were serious but manageable. He would have to delay retirement and live more modestly, but he wouldn't face poverty. The emotional and psychological damage was much more complex and persistent. He found himself second-guessing every human interaction, wondering if people were being genuine or manipulating him for their own purposes. The shame was perhaps the hardest emotion to deal with. David felt humiliated not just by being deceived, but by how completely he had ignored obvious warning signs and rejected the concerns of people who actually cared about him. He had to confront the uncomfortable truth that his desperation for connection and validation had made him vulnerable to exploitation in ways he had never imagined possible. Sleep remained elusive for months after his return. David would lie awake replaying conversations with Ploy, analyzing them for clues he had missed, trying to identify the exact moments when he could have made different choices. The memories that had seemed like treasures were now sources of pain, contaminated by the knowledge of their falseness. Therapy became essential for David's healing process. Working with a counselor who specialized in trauma and financial fraud, he began to understand how sophisticated manipulation tactics could overcome even intelligent people's natural defenses. He learned about love bombing, gaslighting, and the specific techniques used to exploit emotional vulnerabilities in older adults who were isolated or grieving. Understanding the psychology behind what had happened to him helped David forgive himself for falling victim to such an elaborate deception. He learned that people like Ploy were essentially professional predators who studied their victims carefully and had years of experience perfecting their techniques. Recognizing himself as the victim of a crime rather than a fool making bad decisions was an important step in his recovery process. Gradually, David began to rebuild his connections with family and friends who had tried to warn him about his situation. These relationships had been damaged by his defensive reactions to their concerns, but most people were willing to move forward once they understood the extent of his trauma. His daughter Sarah became particularly close to him during this period, helping him navigate both practical challenges and emotional healing. The process of recovery taught David important lessons about vulnerability and resilience that he had never learned during his comfortable middle-class life. He discovered that surviving betrayal and financial disaster could actually make someone stronger and wiser, even if the cost of that education was extremely high. He began to see his Thai experience not just as a devastating mistake, but as a transformation that had revealed both his weaknesses and his capacity to survive them. One unexpected aspect of David's healing was his decision to share his story with others. He started by talking to friends and family about what had happened to him, despite the embarrassment it caused. He discovered that his openness helped other people recognize similar risks in their own lives and relationships. Several friends confided their own experiences with romance scams or financial manipulation that they had been too ashamed to discuss before. Eventually, David began volunteering with organizations that helped victims of romance scams and elder fraud. His background in accounting made him useful in helping other victims untangle their financial situations and minimize ongoing damage. His personal experience gave him credibility with people who were struggling with the shame and self-blame that often accompanied being victimized by someone they had trusted. Speaking to support groups and writing about his experience became part of David's healing process. Each time he told his story, it became less painful and more instructive. He could see how his experience fit into larger patterns of vulnerability and exploitation that affected many people, particularly older adults, navigating dating and relationships in an increasingly complex world. 2 years after returning from Thailand, David reached a milestone in his recovery when he realized he could think about his experience with Ploy without the intense emotional pain that had initially accompanied those memories. The financial impact was still present in his daily life, requiring him to budget more carefully and work longer than he had planned. But the emotional wounds had healed enough that he could extract value from what had happened to him. The most important lesson David learned was about the difference between being needed and being loved. His relationship with Margaret had been based on mutual respect, shared values, and genuine affection that had grown over decades of partnership. His infatuation with Ploy had been based on his need to feel important and masculine, combined with her professional skill at making him believe she needed his protection and support. Real love, David came to understand, was not about rescuing someone or being rescued. It was about two complete people choosing to share their lives while maintaining their individual identities and independence. The fantasy of being someone's savior was actually a form of selfishness, focused more on his own need to feel valuable than on genuine care for another person's well-being and autonomy. David also learned to recognize the warning signs that had been present from the beginning of his relationship with Ploy. The rapid intensity of their connection, her seeming helplessness despite her obvious intelligence, the constant financial emergencies, and his isolation from other perspectives had all been red flags that his desperation had caused him to ignore or rationalize away. Most importantly, he learned that loneliness was not an emergency that required immediate and desperate action. The grief and isolation he had felt after Margaret's death were natural and temporary conditions that would have improved with time and patience. His frantic attempts to escape those feelings through exotic romance had made him vulnerable to exploitation and ultimately caused much more pain than the original loss he was trying to avoid. David's story is far from unique. Every year, thousands of Western men find themselves in similar situations, convinced they are saving vulnerable young women in developing countries while actually being systematically exploited by professional criminals. The combination of cultural misunderstanding, economic inequality, emotional vulnerability, and sophisticated manipulation tactics creates perfect conditions for these elaborate deceptions. What makes David's story particularly instructive is not just the details of how he was deceived, but how he survived and recovered from the experience. Many victims of romance scams never fully heal from the financial and emotional damage. Some become so cynical about human nature that they lose the ability to form genuine connections with others. Others become obsessed with revenge or recovering their losses, wasting additional years and resources on futile pursuits. David chose a different path. He accepted responsibility for his poor decisions while recognizing that he had been the victim of sophisticated criminals. He used his experience to help others avoid similar fates and to advocate for better protection for vulnerable adults. He rebuilt his relationships with family and friends, even though that required swallowing his pride and admitting how wrong he had been about their concerns. Most importantly, David learned to be comfortable with solitude without being desperate to escape it. He developed friendships and activities that brought meaning to his life without requiring him to be someone's savior or hero. He volunteered with organizations that helped seniors navigate technology and financial security. He returned to his hobby of restoring vintage motorcycles. He traveled occasionally, but as a tourist, rather than someone seeking transformation or escape. 3 years after his return from Thailand, David met Patricia at a grief counseling support group. She was a widow of similar age who had lost her husband to heart disease. Their relationship developed slowly and carefully, based on friendship and shared interests rather than dramatic passion or mutual neediness. They maintained separate homes and independent lives while choosing to spend time together because they genuinely enjoyed each other's company. The contrast between his relationship with Patricia and his experience with Ploy taught David the difference between authentic connection and elaborate fantasy. With Patricia, there were no dramatic declarations of eternal love, no desperate needs to be fulfilled, no emergencies requiring rescue, and no sense that either of them was incomplete without the other. Instead, there was comfort, compatibility, shared humor, and the quiet satisfaction of being genuinely known and accepted by another person. If you have found yourself in a situation similar to David's, or if you recognize warning signs in your own relationships or those of people you care about, remember that recovery is possible. The shame and financial damage may feel overwhelming initially, but with time, support, and professional help, it is possible to rebuild your life and learn valuable lessons from even the most devastating experiences. David's story reminds us that the desire to love and be loved can make us vulnerable to those who would exploit our emotions for their own gain. But it also demonstrates that human resilience and the support of family and community can help us survive and learn from even our most costly mistakes. The key is recognizing that being victimized does not make someone weak or foolish, and that sharing our experiences can help protect others from similar harm. Remember to subscribe to our channel for more stories that explore the complexities of human relationships and the lessons we can learn from both triumph and tragedy. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts about David's journey, and follow us for new stories that examine how people navigate love, loss, and the search for meaning in an increasingly complex world. Sometimes the most valuable lessons come from the most painful experiences, and sharing these stories can help all of us make better choices in our own lives.